Chapter 1. The Adoption Center. The Adoption Center sat in the heart of New Haven, a gleaming, modern metropolis, a melting pot where species from every corner of the galaxy converged, lived, and worked. The city was a microcosm of the new reality that Earth had entered into, one where humans had to share space with alien life, forging uneasy yet necessary bonds with races whose customs, habits, and values were so vastly different. The Adoption Center itself was located at the intersection of two major districts, a place where the human population, alongside their alien counterparts, could come to facilitate the most personal of exchanges, the adoption of children from far-off worlds. But this place was no ordinary facility. It was one that catered not only to human children or even hybrid children, but also to those from species across the universe, alien beings who had either been abandoned, orphaned, or, in some cases, were simply caught up in galactic conflict. These were the children whose physical characteristics and cultural differences made them incredibly difficult for most potential families to adopt. They were, in the most unfortunate of ways, deemed unadoptable. The waiting rooms were filled with the quiet murmurs of hopeful visitors, some humans, some alien, some on the edge of taking a step that would change their lives forever, while others simply watched the children in the brightly lit display rooms, unsure of what they would find. Each of the alien girls in the center was unique in her own right, beautiful in her own way, though many bore features that were strange to the human eye. They had limbs that were too long, faces too angular, skin in colors that ranged from shades of green, purple, blue, and yellow. Their eyes, often larger than human eyes, glowed with an otherworldly light, and their movements were sometimes stiff and robotic, like they were uncertain how to act in a world that wasn't built for them. Despite their differences, they were children vulnerable, yearning for love, for a family that would give them a place in the world. But despite the best efforts of the workers in the center, no one ever seemed to want them. Visitors, if they even bothered to take a glance, would wince at their physical differences. They would quickly turn their attention to the more conventional, children, human-like children, or those with minimal physical differences. These children, with their bright eyes and gentle smiles, were seen as more acceptable, and the alien girls were left to wait. The workers at the adoption center, who had grown used to seeing the same disappointment day after day, did their best to encourage people to look past the physicality of these children and see their potential, to see the love and joy they could bring into the lives of adoptive families. But it was a hard sell. In a world where appearances often dictated one's value, the alien girls couldn't help but be overlooked, sidelined by their differences. It was on one of these slow afternoons, when the center was particularly quiet, that James Ross found himself standing at the entrance of the adoption center. James wasn't your average potential parent. He wasn't someone who had come to the center with the idea of adopting a child. He wasn't someone who had ever given much thought to family, especially the idea of taking in a child who was from another world. He had always lived a solitary life, one that revolved around his work and his limited social interactions. A mechanic by trade, James spent his days fixing things, machines, vehicles, technology, and he preferred it that way. He liked his life uncomplicated, no strings attached, no obligations. But today, however, as he stood in front of the center, the reality of his life was beginning to shift. James had never thought of himself as someone who would take in a child, let alone an alien one. The idea of being a father had never seemed like something that could fit into his life. And yet, there was something about the adoption center that pulled him in. Maybe it was the bright, cold lighting that gave the building an almost clinical feel, or perhaps it was the notion that there were lives here, alien lives that needed saving. Maybe it was the whisper of something deeper within him, a call to action, something he had suppressed for so long. But as he stood there, staring at the children inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to make a decision that would change everything. He stepped inside. The atmosphere inside the center was nothing like what he had expected. It wasn't a sterile, cold place full of paperwork and impersonal interactions. It was more like a museum of alien lives, of histories that had not yet been written. The children sat in neat rows, each one waiting for someone, anyone, to choose them. It was a place filled with longing, silent, quiet longing that filled the air like an invisible mist. James could feel it as soon as he stepped inside, the weight of hundreds of eyes staring at him, each child silently asking to be seen, to be chosen. But his eyes didn't go to the children he expected to find, ones that resembled human children, or even those who looked like they could fit into society. Instead, his gaze was drawn to the girls in the far corner of the room. They were different. Their skin was an unusual shade of pale green, and their faces were framed by wisps of silvery hair. One of the girls was much taller than the others, her limbs long and spindly, while the other was shorter, with wide, innocent eyes that seemed to be absorbing everything around her. Their bodies were a patchwork of unusual features, sharp angles, delicate skin that shimmered faintly in the light, and eyes that were far too big for their faces. Despite their alien appearances, there was something about them that struck James. Maybe it was the vulnerability in their expressions, or maybe it was the quiet way they sat, as if they had given up on hope. The adoption worker, a woman named Mira, who had been quietly observing James's reaction to the children, approached him with a cautious smile. "Are you interested in adopting?" she asked, her voice soft, almost as if she were afraid to disturb the fragile calm in the room. James was still staring at the two alien girls in the corner. There was something in their eyes, something he couldn't place. Something that made him feel both deeply uncomfortable and unexpectedly drawn to them. He turned to Mira, his mouth dry. "What about those two?" he asked, pointing to the girls. Mira followed his gaze and nodded slowly. "Those two," she said softly, "have been here for a long time. They are very different from the others. Most people don't want to adopt them." James raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "They're harder to relate to. The larger girl has some behavioral challenges. She's not very communicative. And the other one? Well, she's very shy. Most people shy away from the differences." James felt a pang in his chest. He knew exactly what Mira meant. These girls weren't pretty by human standards. They weren't the type you'd see playing on the playground or running through a field of flowers, their laughter filling the air. No, these girls were different. They were odd. They were alien. But, for reasons he couldn't articulate, James found himself feeling something for them. They weren't just abandoned because they were different, they were abandoned because they didn't conform. They were outcasts, and it broke something in him. Without thinking, he nodded, his voice gruff as he spoke. "I'll take them." Mira blinked, her expression unreadable. "You're sure?" James didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't the type of man who had ever thought about raising children, let alone alien children. But something inside him shifted in that moment. He couldn't walk away. These girls, these strangers, needed someone to show them that they mattered. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, he knew that he was the one to give them that chance. "I'll take them," he repeated, his voice more certain this time. Mira hesitated, then nodded. "All right, I'll get the paperwork started." As Mira took James through the paperwork and procedures of adopting the two alien girls, he found himself lost in thought, still trying to comprehend the enormity of what he had just agreed to. He had walked into this adoption center expecting to simply observe, maybe get a better understanding of how it all worked. He hadn't expected to walk out with two alien girls who would now depend on him for everything. But now that he had made the decision, there was no turning back. The paperwork was a blur. Forms for legal guardianship, medical evaluations, cultural sensitivity, training, all of it rushed by in a haze. Mira spoke to him in quiet tones, explaining the steps he needed to take, but James barely absorbed any of it. He was too preoccupied with the thought of what lay ahead. The responsibility weighed heavily on him, and he felt an overwhelming sense of uncertainty about what it meant to raise alien children. He had no idea what they would need, how they would respond to him, or how to manage the complexities of their biology, their culture, and their history. He was a mechanic, not a parent, and certainly not a parent to two strange, alien children who would challenge everything he knew about what it meant to be human. Eventually, Mira led him to a room where Varia and Nara were waiting. They sat on opposite ends of the room, their large, glowing eyes watching James as he entered. Varia, the taller one with the long, spindly limbs and silver-gray skin, seemed to take up more space in the room, her gaze sharp and calculating. Nara, the smaller one, looked more fragile, her delicate features framed by wisps of silvery hair that shimmered faintly in the light. Both girls sat with their legs tucked beneath them, their faces unreadable. It was clear they had been waiting for someone, waiting for a family, but that there was no excitement, no rush to greet the stranger who had entered their world. James stood in the doorway, unsure of what to do next. The room felt sterile, clinical, as if it was a place meant for transactions rather than emotions. The girls didn't move, didn't speak. It felt like they had accepted the reality of being abandoned, of waiting in this strange, impersonal place for someone to claim them. There was no joy, no celebration of this momentous change in their lives. It was simply a continuation of the silence and isolation that had defined their existence for so long. Mira stepped forward and placed a hand on James's shoulder, her tone gentle. "These are the two you've chosen, Varia and Nara. They're sisters, though they don't speak much. They communicate with each other in their own way. They're very close." James nodded, his gaze shifting between the two girls. He wasn't sure what to say. His words felt inadequate, hollow even. How could he explain to them that, despite their differences, they had a place in his life now? How could he make them believe that he would do his best to care for them, even though he didn't understand what that meant? The silence in the room was deafening, as if the three of them were waiting for the next step, the next action to break the stillness. Varia finally spoke, her voice soft but clear, though it had an otherworldly quality that matched her appearance. "You're taking us with you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. There was no joy in her voice, just a faint thread of disbelief, as though she couldn't comprehend the reality of it. James cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "Yes," he said, his voice more uncertain than he had hoped. "I'm taking you with me. We'll figure things out together." Nara, who had been sitting quietly on the floor, looked up at James with large, silent eyes. She didn't say anything, but her gaze seemed to penetrate him, as though she was trying to understand him, trying to decipher his intentions. It was as if the child was trying to gauge whether he was truly capable of what he had promised or if he was just another fleeting figure in a long series of people who had let her down. James could see the hesitance in her eyes, and it made his stomach twist. He wasn't sure he could do this, not really. But he had already made the choice, and there was no going back. Mira took a step back, giving James space to speak with the girls. She gave him a quick nod, as if silently telling him that this was his moment to connect with them. The pressure of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he didn't know how else to proceed. He had never been a parent, and the thought of trying to make two alien girls feel at home in his life felt impossible. "All right, let's go," James said, his voice more confident this time. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. He wasn't sure what to expect, whether the girls would resist or accept his presence, but as he reached for the hand of Varia, the taller one, she didn't pull away. Instead, she placed her hand in his with a soft, tentative motion. Nara followed suit, her smaller hand brushing against his as she stepped closer. For a moment, there was a shared silence between them, an unspoken understanding that this was the beginning of something new. James didn't know what kind of future lay ahead, but for the first time since he had entered the adoption center, he felt like he was doing something important, something meaningful. Chapter 2. The Adjustment. The drive home was long and uncomfortable. James could feel the unease that lingered in the car, the awkward silence that stretched between them. Varia sat in the passenger seat, her long limbs folded as she stared out of the window, her face expressionless. Nara sat in the back, her small form curled up with her arms wrapped around her knees. Every now and then, she would glance up at James, her glowing eyes studying him with a quiet intensity, as if trying to decipher who this strange human man was who had taken them in. James had tried to make small talk, but the words felt forced. He didn't know how to talk to these girls, didn't know what they needed to hear. His usual gruff, mechanical way of speaking didn't seem to fit the moment. And so, he remained quiet, focusing on the road ahead, the hum of the engine the only sound in the car. His apartment was modest small, filled with tools and mechanical parts from his various repair jobs. It was nothing special, but it had been home for years. Now, as he parked the car in front of the building, he realized that it was about to become something else entirely. It would no longer be just his space, it would be theirs as well. He wasn't sure how to make room for them, how to shift his life to accommodate the presence of two alien girls who had no place to go. But as he got out of the car and walked around to open the door for them, he felt a sense of responsibility settle over him. Varia stepped out first, her tall, thin frame unfolding as she adjusted to the new surroundings. Nara followed closely behind, her eyes darting around as if she were processing every detail of the world around her. They weren't the children he had imagined adopting. They weren't sweet, smiling little faces begging for attention. Instead, they were guarded, unsure of what this new chapter in their lives would bring. And James wasn't sure what to expect, either. This wasn't just a routine adoption. This was a leap into the unknown, one that he had taken with no clear idea of how he would navigate it. But as he opened the door to his apartment and gestured for the girls to enter, he knew that there was no turning back now. This was his responsibility. They were his responsibility. And together, they would have to find a way to make it work. As they stepped inside the apartment, the cool air inside felt like a stark contrast to the warm sunlight they had left behind. The walls were cluttered with old mechanical parts, tools, and half-finished projects, evidence of a life James had built, but not one that had ever been shared. Now, with Varia and Nara in tow, it felt strange. The apartment was too small, too cluttered, and too solitary for three people to coexist in. But this was their new reality. The girls hadn't said anything since they had gotten into the car, and they didn't say anything as they entered the apartment. Varia immediately moved to the window, her tall frame standing out in the small living room. She stared out at the city below, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in her new surroundings. Nara, on the other hand, seemed more cautious. She stayed by the door for a moment, her gaze flicking from James to the unfamiliar surroundings, clearly overwhelmed by the change. James stood at a distance, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't the kind of person who could simply snap into a role of fatherhood. There were no instructions for raising alien children, no easy answers. He had no idea what these girls needed or how to make them feel comfortable. But he also knew that standing there, doing nothing, wouldn't help either. "All right," James said, trying to muster some level of confidence, though his voice felt rough. "This is home now. It's not much, but it's ours." He took a few steps forward, trying to make the words sound welcoming, though he knew they probably came off as awkward and unsure. Varia turned her head, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they had entered. Her expression was unreadable, though there was a flicker of something behind those alien eyes. Curiosity? Skepticism? James couldn't tell, but he could sense that Varia was trying to make sense of her new environment, just as he was. She didn't speak, but she slowly moved toward the couch, sitting down in a fluid, graceful motion that seemed almost deliberate. Nara followed her, though she didn't sit down. Instead, she stood beside the couch, her small body tense, her eyes constantly scanning the room as if she were on high alert. James felt an odd pang in his chest. He knew that these girls, these alien beings, weren't just adapting to their new life, they were surviving it. They had seen things that he couldn't even imagine. They had been abandoned, rejected, and now they were in a place that was as unfamiliar to them as it was to him. The weight of that responsibility hit him hard, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the practical matters. He needed to make them feel like this was their home, too. The thought made him nervous, but he did his best to keep it together. Do you want something to eat?" he asked, his words a little hesitant. It was the one thing he could offer them that felt like something a father should do. He didn't know what an alien child would eat, what they might even like, but he figured food was a good place to start. Both girls didn't respond immediately. Varia's eyes shifted to him briefly, then back to the window, as though she was deep in thought. Nara, however, glanced up at him, her eyes wide but still unreadable. She didn't move, but she seemed to wait for his next move, as if trying to gauge what was going to happen next. James didn't want to push. He didn't know what they were used to, but he knew that making them feel comfortable was more important than anything else. "All right," he said, forcing a chuckle to lighten the tension. "You're probably tired after everything that's happened. How about we just take it easy tonight? I'll fix some food, and we can relax." The silence that followed felt heavy. James moved toward the kitchen, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his stomach. He didn't want to admit it, but he was scared. What had he gotten himself into? What did these girls need from him? What could he give them? The fear of failure pressed on him as he opened the fridge, staring at its sparse contents. A few cans of soup, some leftover takeout, a bottle of water. Nothing that screamed family dinner, but it would have to do. As he heated up the soup, he could hear soft footsteps behind him. He glanced over his shoulder to see Nara standing by the kitchen table, watching him carefully. You hungry?" James asked, his voice quieter this time, unsure if she understood. Nara's large eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, there was a strange stillness in the room. James felt as though they were communicating in ways he couldn't understand through glances, through silence. She didn't answer, but she moved closer to the table and sat down on one of the chairs, her movements slow, deliberate. James felt a small surge of hope. She might not say anything, but she was at least here, trying to be a part of this. Slowly, he ladled the soup into 2 bowls, setting one in front of her, and the other for himself. Varia, however, didn't move from the couch. She continued to stare out the window, lost in her own thoughts. It was as though she wasn't even aware of the world around her, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass. James decided not to push her, letting her sit in her silence. He wasn't sure if she needed space or if she just didn't care, but he didn't want to make her feel pressured to join the moment. After a few minutes of sitting in the kitchen, James sat down at the table, taking his own bowl of soup and eating slowly, trying to gauge the girls' reactions. Chapter 3: Growing Pains. Days turned into weeks, and though the silence between James and the twins was heavy, it was no longer awkward. The twins, Varia and Nara, had settled into their new life with him, though they did so in their own unique ways. Varia continued to maintain a distance, watching from the sidelines, rarely engaging directly, but always present. She had a quiet, thoughtful demeanor about her, as though she was constantly observing the world and processing everything in her own way. Nara, on the other hand, was more active, more curious, though still reserved. She would often follow James around the apartment, standing in doorways, watching as he worked on his projects or tinkered with his tools. She didn't say much, but her large eyes tracked every movement he made. James had tried many things to engage with them, but it was clear that both of them were not used to affection, not in the way humans typically showed it. They didn't seek out physical contact or try to engage in normal conversations. There was no crying, no tantrums, and no excitement over the smallest things. They simply existed. It was a quiet existence, one that felt foreign to James but was slowly becoming part of his life. One afternoon, while James was fixing the washing machine in the corner of the apartment, he noticed Varia staring at him from the couch. Her gaze was intense, almost unnerving, as if she were studying him, trying to understand him. He didn't know what she was thinking, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on in her mind than she let on. Nara was playing with a small toy on the floor, her small hands pressing and pulling at the buttons in a methodical way, but Varia remained still, her eyes never leaving James. It was then that something unexpected happened. Varia stood up, walked over to him, and placed her hand on his shoulder. James froze, unsure of how to react. This was the first time she had made any kind of physical gesture toward him. It wasn't much, just a simple touch, but it was enough. The contact, however brief, sent a wave of warmth through his chest, and he realized that despite their differences, despite the alien nature of the twins, they had somehow started to trust him. "Thank you," Varia said quietly, her voice soft and almost hesitant. James blinked in surprise. He hadn't expected her to speak, let alone express gratitude. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something that told him they were making progress, that they were beginning to feel the first flickers of attachment, of connection. "No problem," James said, his voice a little thick with emotion. "I'm happy you're here." Varia didn't say anything more, but she smiled, a small, tentative curve of her lips that was as alien as it was familiar. James returned the smile, unsure of how to process the emotions that were welling up inside him. These girls, these alien children, were not just his responsibility anymore. They had become part of his world, and for the first time since he had met them, he realized that maybe, just maybe, they needed him just as much as he needed them. As the days continued to unfold, James understood more clearly what being a parent meant. It wasn't about forcing affection, about changing someone to fit into a mold. It was about being present, about showing up even when it was hard, even when the silence was overwhelming. And with every silent moment, every small gesture, every look exchanged, he knew that they were slowly building something that resembled family, even if it wasn't the family he had imagined. As the weeks stretched into months, a subtle transformation began to take place within the walls of James's modest apartment. What had started as an uneasy, unfamiliar arrangement between the grumpy mechanic and two alien girls was slowly evolving into something that resembled a family, though not one that anyone would call conventional. The days were no longer silent. They were filled with quiet exchanges, the occasional soft sound of Varia's voice, or the faint hum of Nara's gentle song in an alien language, a melody that somehow calmed the atmosphere. James didn't know exactly when it happened, when the awkwardness finally gave way to something more comfortable. Maybe it was the days he spent fixing things around the apartment, tinkering with tools while the twins observed, or perhaps it was those small, almost imperceptible gestures of connection. Varia would occasionally place her hand on his shoulder, and Nara would look up at him, her glowing eyes following his every move with an inquisitive intensity. The isolation that had defined James's life for so long was slowly being replaced by a strange, yet undeniable, bond with these girls. It wasn't a bond built on words, but rather on shared silence, on the quiet understanding that they were all figuring it out as they went along. For the first time in his life, James felt responsible for someone other than himself. It wasn't a responsibility born out of duty or obligation, it was something deeper. He cared for these girls, even if they didn't always show it in the ways he expected. And in return, they began to show him something he hadn't known he needed: trust. It wasn't the kind of trust that came easily or quickly, but it was growing. Slowly, but steadily, it was there. One afternoon, as James sat on the couch, sipping his coffee and staring out the window at the city below, he felt the familiar tug at his sleeve. Nara had climbed onto the couch beside him, her tiny form almost hidden beneath the fabric. Her eyes were wide, curious, as she peered up at him, but she said nothing. James set down his mug, feeling the weight of her gaze, the unspoken question in her eyes. "You want to talk about something?" James asked gently, though he didn't expect an answer. To his surprise, Nara nodded. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear, though still laced with an alien melody. "Why do you help us?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. "You don't have to." James stared at her for a long moment, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions. It was the first time either of the twins had asked a question like that, and it struck him deeply. "Because I want to," he said simply, his voice soft. I know what it feels like to be alone, Nara. And I don't want you two to feel like that anymore." Nara seemed to consider his words for a moment before looking away, her fingers gently twirling one of the loose strands of her hair. For a brief moment, the apartment felt more like a home than it ever had before. It wasn't perfect, nothing about their situation was, but it was a start. And in that moment, it was enough. Varia, who had been sitting at the window, turned her head slightly, her attention finally shifting to James and Nara. Her voice, when it came, was low, almost thoughtful. "Thank you," she said, though it was more of an acknowledgement than an emotional outburst. Still, James couldn't help but feel the sincerity in her words. It wasn't much, but it was progress. A connection, no matter how small, had been made. Chapter 4: The Family We Build. A few months had passed, and things had begun to settle into a new, strange normal. James wasn't entirely sure when it had happened, when he had crossed the threshold from being the grumpy, solitary mechanic who had stumbled into adopting two alien girls to becoming a father. It wasn't a moment that could be pinpointed. It was a gradual, almost imperceptible change, one that came with time, patience, and the growing realization that his life had fundamentally shifted. The twins had become his responsibility, yes, but they had also become his family. They were no longer the quiet, distant beings who had first entered his home. Varia had started to talk more, her voice still tinged with the strange, melodic inflections of her alien language, but it had grown more regular, more comfortable in its cadence. Nara, too, had become more expressive, showing her emotions more openly, though her gestures and expressions remained unlike anything James had encountered before. It was as if they were speaking a language that only the three of them understood, a language formed not through words but through their shared experiences, their growing connection. One evening, as the sun set and the orange light flooded through the windows of their apartment, James sat at the table, working on one of his many repair projects. He had become accustomed to the presence of the twins, their silent company a steady, grounding force in his life. As he worked, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to find Varia standing there, a small object in her hand. It was a piece of technology, something James hadn't seen before, likely alien in origin, perhaps even something from her home world. She held it out to him, her eyes serious. "I want to learn," Varia said quietly, her voice steady but filled with an unfamiliar determination. "I want to help." James blinked in surprise, unsure of what to say. He had never thought about teaching them anything practical, let alone mechanics. But as he looked at Varia, holding out the alien object, he realized something. She wasn't asking for his help the way a child would. She was asking to be part of his world, to learn from him in the only way she knew how. This was more than just a child seeking attention. This was Varia, offering herself as a willing student in a world she didn't understand, but one she wanted to be part of. For the first time, James felt something stir in his chest that wasn't just responsibility. It was pride. Pride that these alien girls, so different from him, had chosen him as their guide, their protector. And it was with that sense of pride that James took the object from her hand, nodding slowly. "All right," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Let's see what we can do." As the days passed, Varia and Nara began to help him more often, learning what they could of the strange, human technology that James worked with. They would sit with him as he worked, watching him with intense interest, mimicking his movements, and picking up the basics. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always smooth. There were moments of frustration, of confusion, but James found himself teaching them, guiding them through the process with patience. And with each lesson, the bond between them grew stronger. Varia and Nara were no longer just alien children living in his apartment. They were becoming his daughters in ways that defied the boundaries of species, language, and culture. One evening, after a long day of work, as the three of them sat together on the couch, something remarkable happened. James had been waiting for Varia and Nara to express anything that would give him a sense of how far they had come. And that night, as the quiet settled around them, it came. Nara, who had always been so reserved, reached out and placed her hand on his. It wasn't a simple gesture. It was a sign of trust, of love, of acceptance. And for the first time in months, James felt the full weight of his decision settle in his chest, not as a burden, but as something precious. "We're family now," Nara whispered, her voice soft, but filled with an unmistakable warmth. James didn't need to say anything. The words weren't necessary. As he looked at Varia, who was watching him with an expression that bordered on affection, he realized that it didn't matter that they weren't human, that they came from a distant planet. They had become his family, in every sense of the word. And in return, he had given them the one thing they had always needed, a place to belong. With that thought, James knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Not as strangers, not as alien children and a grumpy human mechanic, but as a family born not from biology, but from choice. And that, he realized, was more than enough.